My name's David Lorimer. I'm Global Ambassador and Program Director of the Scientific and Medical Network, and we're celebrating our Jubilee year. And I have with me my very old friend, Dr. Iain McGilchrist, who's one of our honorary members. And so this is part of the series of interviews with honorary members to celebrate our Golden Jubilee. So Iain, we're speaking respectively from France and Skye, very different
Yes.
geographical
Yeah.
locations, when weather
Yes.
patterns, I should add. And so,
Indeed.
how were you inspired in your various lines of work? Because there isn't a simple answer in your case of sort of one track, because you've been on many tracks. So, who
Yes.
who inspired you in how your life
Yes.
has evolved?
Well, there's a number of people, some living, some not, and some who influenced me more personally in the sense of making me who I am, and others whose ideas put me on a certain path. So I think I would begin really, I think chronologically, with my Winchester housemaster, Martin Scott. He was an extraordinarily inspiring figure to me. You have to imagine somebody like a very jovial medieval abbot, large and smiling. His face was always crumpling up, and he was about to laugh. But he was also a deeply serious and spiritual man. And he taught me a lot of things, among them being the way in which being a serious and spiritual person in no way means that you have to avoid humor. He taught me that they go together, in fact. And he taught me many other things, including a sort of broad religious outlook, and a broad humanist view of our civilization and society. And so it's almost impossible to imagine who I would have been if I hadn't been under his care between the ages of 12 and 17, I suppose.
And just
So
let me
he was a
interject
very,
interject there, because just to
yes,
say that I knew Martin very well as well,
yes,
because I taught at Winchester at a later stage, and he was absolutely a larger than life character, and the laughter and
yes.
humor and sense of proportion. I think you brought that all out. So, but do carry on.
No, he was a thoroughly wonderful person, and thank you for the sense of proportion, which I think is really the other side of a sense of humor, and people who lack it lack a sense of proportion. And increasingly, I feel that our world is one in which nothing can be kept in proportion anymore. Having gradations of ascent and descent is extraordinarily important. In fact, probably the main. I think there was an Etonian master who said this in the 19th century, that the purpose of education was to allow people to express ascent and descent in gradations, something we seem to have lost. And already I was a bit of a Gemini. I started off on the science specializations. We had various streams at school, we call them
A
ladders.
ladders and
Um,
B ladders, yes.
Yes, A ladder was classics, B ladder was humanities, really broadly, history and languages, and English, and the C ladder was science. And my grandfather had interested me in science from an early age, and I'd always thought of myself as destined for science. So I started off on the C ladder, but there were various aspects of it that slightly depressed me and didn't stretch me. And I thought, actually, what I'm more interested in is the humanities, and I moved to that. And then finally, before I left school, I went back to specializing in the classics again. Of course, we all had to do that at an earlier part of our time at Winchester, but I wanted to go back and really go deeper into Latin and Greek. And then Martin got me interested in William James, who's become a very significant figure for me, has been really ever since I read The Varieties of Religious Experience at school at Martin's suggestion. And he's gone on being a leading star for me. I also got to know at school Heraclitus, and I thought, well, we spend an awful lot of time on Plato in class, but actually it seems to me that Heraclitus is seeing things that Plato seems to have overlooked, and that they are really deeply, profoundly important. Things like the coincidence of opposites, the fact that everything flows, and so forth. And much later, I found resonances with Taoism in my early 20s when I read for the first time Alan Watts's Tao, the Watercourse Way, which was also very influential. Also, around the time I was a young fellow in Oxford, the Awakenings by Oliver Sacks was published, and that had a big influence on me. Another really very important influence, because it seemed to me fascinating to be able to draw together the mind and body in this absolutely inseparable way, that not that there is no distinction between them, but there is no severance between them. And that's another the
Very good
distinction between
distinction.
distinction on one hand and severance on the other is very important. So what I saw there was he was able to give really very living portraits of individual people, and yet from their individual cases to be able to see profound general principles. And this was done seamlessly in the way that Goethe recommended, that one found the general not by turning one's back on the individual and waffling off into a very abstract space, but instead looking at the individual case so deeply that through it and in it you see embodied more deep general principles. So that inspired me very much, because I felt there was something wrong with the way in which we approached literature, which was effectively disembodied. I found the philosophers too disembodied in their approach to the mind-body problem, and I wanted to approach that problem in a more embodied way, and that led to my doing medicine. And I think so Oliver Sacks would be pretty important. And I think all along, nobody could be Oliver Sacks because he's a highly individual person and a brilliant man. But his capacity to do that, to sit on this border between neurology and psychiatry and yet see deep philosophical questions being addressed, that was another very important inspiration to me. Then another one would be John Cutting, who I met at the Maudsley, who had written about the right cerebral hemisphere. And I've talked about this before, but I went to a lecture of his which changed the direction of my life by illuminating for me that there was something much, much deeper and subtler and more philosophically interesting going on in the separation of the two hemispheres than was widely held to be the case. And he encouraged me, in the face of many people discouraging me, to get deeper into the issue of hemisphere difference, because, of course, famously back then, it had become pop psychology, and everyone said nobody will take you seriously if you do it. But I did, and I hope quite a lot of people are taking it seriously now. And then there was Louis Sass, whose book Madness and Modernism helped me see that certain patterns in culture simulated differences between the hemispheres. He looked at it in terms of modernism and its relationship to schizophrenia, the way in which people with schizophrenia describe experiencing the world in the way that was widely espoused in the literature, art, and thought of modernism. That was an extraordinary revelation, and it wasn't so much.
Just to interrupt again, Liam, you recommended that book to me at the time, and I read it with huge interest and profit, and met Louis and his family in Jamaica, all as a result of that conversation we had.
Oh, wonderful. Yes. Well, he's a great man. He's a lovely man, and he's super bright. And he is not just a distinguished lecturer, but he is a distinguished with a capital D lecturer at Rutgers. And I'm glad that his excellence is recognized, but he's a man of enormous breadth and insight. So, see, John Cutting was not just a narrowly focused psychiatrist. He was interested in the brain, the mind, and philosophy. And Louis Sass was not just a brilliant psychologist. He was interested in the brain, the mind, and philosophy. And they were seeing things that people who sat too tightly in one of the silos wouldn't have seen. So they both opened my eyes very considerably. considerably. And then in more recent years, I suppose that the leading influences on me, along with William James, as I've been writing more philosophically, have been Bergson and Whitehead. So those are the sort of the names, some of them that I knew, some of them that I never, alas, knew, who changed the direction of my life.
So interesting. I think you might even add FCS Schiller into that list. He's somebody who's much less well known as the others than the others, rather.
Yes, that's absolutely right. He is very important and interesting too, but I don't think that his overall influence on me was as great as that of Bergson and Whitehead. But I mean, there are very few authors, and William James, Bergson, and Whitehead are the only ones I know, because I'm not in the habit of writing in books. I take notes, but I was so enthused by my reading that I kept marking in the margin, and almost every page has got, kind of, yes, another insight. So that was very, very special.
Yes, very. I mean, these are people who've influenced my thinking enormously as well. But what a rich
Yes.
answer, Ian, and typical of your style and the way in which you approach life: mind, brain, philosophy, neuroscience, and keeping in the flow, both the flow of Heraclitus and the flow of the Tao. So this
Yeah.
leads on to the next question, which is what you feel to be your greatest contributions. You know, obviously you've started to talk about that, but maybe you just elaborate in how you see that yourself.
Yes, well, one never really knows what contribution one's making or whether one's making a contribution at all. I'm beginning to believe that I am, from the sheer numbers of people who write to me or come up to me and tell me that my writing has changed their lives, which is a very profound thing for me, very wonderful thing to hear. And I suppose I would point to, very obviously, hemisphere theory as being my biggest contribution intellectually, I think. But also it is part of and inseparable from the other thing that I consider important, which is, and I'm just a foot soldier in the army, as it were, of those who are providing some kind of defense for us against the rise, until recently anyway, of materialist reductionism. So I see that myself as, if I've got a contribution to make, it's in a more technical way, over having, I hope, illuminated the real differences between the cerebral hemispheres and the import of those differences, but also in battling against the intellectually and morally bankrupt philosophy of scientific materialism and reductionism, which I think is leading us into areas of disaster.
Indeed, and then there's the whole transhumanist agenda, which is informed by that very same view.
Exactly. I think we need to recover what the idea of a human being is. Some people seem to have no idea. They imagine that we're just faulty machines.
Indeed, indeed. I think this is the central question that they were both focused on. And then how do you see the evolution of the relationship between science and spirituality and theories of consciousness more generally? How do you see that evolving over the next 10, 20 years?
Well, as Niels Bohr said, prediction is a very difficult question, particularly when it concerns the future. So I'm not sure. Yes, but I would probably say two things. For what it's worth, I feel there is a move back against that scientific reductionism and materialism. And I think that the openness to the fact that we can't describe a so-called material universe separate from consciousness, and that consciousness is profoundly important in any account of ontology or metaphysics. I think that was very obvious in physics 100 years ago, but it's increasingly becoming obvious to biologists, at least those at the forefront these days. And so I'm hopeful that there will be important collaborations here and an openness between the two parties. I'm involved in writing a paper at the moment with David Bentley Hart on the fact that science and spirituality are not at loggerheads with one another, but need one another. So I think that's the direction that things are beginning to go, particularly amongst the young. Once again, quoting a great physicist, Max Planck's idea that in fact science progresses one funeral at a time. And you don't really hope to convince the diehards who've made their career out of a certain way of thinking, but you do hope to influence those whose minds are still open. And I think this is happening. So that is very positive. It will, though, mean that we need to think differently about the way in which they can approach one another. For example, there is now something that looks very positive, which is that in the world of Anglo-American analytic philosophy, which is, in my view, extremely left hemisphere bound, procedural, algorithmic, almost in its quest for knowledge, there is now an openness to the idea of panpsychism. But the fascinating thing there is that it's typically left hemispheric in the way in which it operates. So it sees the question, well, are you saying that there's psyche in this? There probably is, yes. And there's psyche in this over here. So how do we add them together? But of course, this is the left hemisphere's problem, starting from little bits and imagining, as ever, that you build something up. But consciousness is not of this kind. Consciousness pervades the cosmos. And these things are not so much, whatever that means, themselves conscious. They probably are in some sense. But the important thing is that they all exist as aspects of universal consciousness, of consciousness which I believe is the ontological primitive of the cosmos. So it depends how this is built on, and it would need to be built on by science in a somehow more open, flexible, and philosophically sophisticated way than just replacing one kind of analytic reductionism by another. However, although I can see rays of hope there, I'm very concerned about the relationship between technology and spirituality. And here I can see a pitched battle coming, and one that it's very important that we don't lose on behalf of humanity and the idea of the soul, the spirit, and all that understands that is in the substance of the world that we're privileged to live in.
Thank you, Iain. I I agree with everything you say there, and particularly the left hemisphere approach to panpsychism. It's a move in the right direction, but with the wrong outlook, as it were. And so you wouldn't start from here if you're trying to go there, as they said, in terms of this. If you're lost, then where do you start from?
Yes, hibernicism. Yes, that's right.
Yes.
Well, and I say that with all due respect to the Irish, who I consider have an enormous, both intuitive and intellectual strength. But no, I think there's something very important in what you just mentioned by looking at it the wrong way, because I do constantly stress that the way in which we attend to everything changes what is there. I won't go into all that because I've said it 1,000 times, but it sometimes seems rather abstract to people, almost like it could be an add-on. Well, we must do these things like clean up the oceans and stop people felling forests and all this, and of course we need to. But I constantly make the point that this won't do us any good if we still see the world in this way, this left hemispheric way in which things are isolated, abstract, general in nature, and inanimate, effectively. We need to re-inanimate the world, and to do that means starting from in here. And that sounds like we haven't got time. But what I want to say is, mate, we've got to have time, because everything else won't add up to doing the job unless we're able to start with ourselves. And it's not a very, very long process. It can, of course, take a very long time, but we can actually start today by changing our ways of attending, the ways we see things, the way we think about things. And one of the commonest things said to me by people who read my work is, you've helped me to see something that once seen lives with me and I can't lose it. Now, if that's the case, then, well, obviously I'd like people to read my work, but I'd like them just to think that the important thing is having the right disposition of their consciousness, of their heart and mind and soul, not just the actions of their hands, important as they are.
No, totally. I mean, simplistically, you'd say we need a different lens. We need a
Yes,
different viewpoint coming from that
yes,
wholeness, the imagination, the intuition, the heart, what you characterize as the right hemisphere as primary. And it's a basic
yes,
epistemological and ontological move, but from which
yes,
everything else follows. And I think that's your
yes,
point,
yes.
because otherwise
I
you're
think,
starting
yes,
from the wrong place in the reductionist or one particular problem that you're trying to address.
yes. It's like trying to um, put a plaster on a cancer without sort of realizing that there's something underneath this that is causing the eruptions you're trying to deal with. And you need to treat that, not just the superficial consequences. So that, in some ways, grave as they are, the crises that beset us are the symptoms of something much deeper lying.
No, I totally agree, and I think that's why we need to go back to this, the roots and the larger context, both historical context of how things are now, how they've arisen, and
Mm,
without understanding that and approaching that in a new way, then we'll go on
mm.
recreating new versions of the same challenges that we're struggling with at the moment.
Yes,
Anyway,
yes.
let's move on from that, Iain. How do you see the role of organizations like the network, within this overall field of operation, if I can put it that way?
Well, I think they're utterly vital, and I don't think they've ever been more important than they are today. The SMN, the Scientific and Medical Network, is a quite unparalleled forum for the coming together of science and spirituality. And it has many strengths, one of which is the breadth of its membership. So, from Nobel Prize winning physicists to poets, ecologists, doctors like myself, thinkers of all kinds from different walks of life, prepared to set aside for a moment the dogmas that they have been brought up to believe and just look at things in a relatively dispassionate way and see if something else emerges. And it's a great place, a space in which scientists can themselves, for a while, break out of the outmoded dogmas that govern their professional lives so much of the time. So I think it's, if you like, it's like a womb in which certain things can come to grow and flourish, and without it, where will they grow and flourish? So I really do think it's of vital importance.
Well, thank you very much for those encouraging remarks. And coming to the last and probably the most difficult and challenging question, which is what are the lessons you've learned from life, both professionally and personally? What stays in your mind? What would you pass on to our
Yes,
listeners?
gosh, yes. Well, professionally, I think rather in line with what I've been saying, I would encourage people to dare to go beyond received wisdom. There's nothing at all wrong with received wisdom. Without it, we have to start again, each of us, without the benefit of the thinking of those who came before us. So in some ways, I'm a great champion of the wisdoms of the past, but I'm also aware that we can adopt as principles things that are rather unwise. We've done quite a lot of that in the last 250 years. Not sufficiently nuanced, not sufficiently adumbrated with their contraries, positions which are too inflexible, effectively, and that this is holding us back, not just in science itself, but in the way in which we deal with all the problems that face us, including socio-political and philosophical problems. We need to be able to balance what we've learned with the ability to open our minds to things that seem to us to call to us with something that appears to be deep or true. And so that requires a degree of being brave, really. And it's particularly difficult nowadays, especially if you're a scientist, because it's become more conformist than it ever was, partly because of the way in which it's organized around very expensive machinery, a lot of it today, and with very expensive institutes, people drawing enormous grants, and that they can't really accommodate somebody who wants to say, but hang on, what if? Instead, they just want to get on with justifying their grants and producing results in line with what everyone else has thought. So I think both philosophically speaking and practically speaking, I think one needs to go beyond received wisdom. And I can think of many cases in my own life where I've been advised strongly to do a certain thing or not to do a certain thing. And I've taken my own advice, not without having thought long and deep about what people were saying, because it had truth. But I have not regretted any one of those decisions, never. And I think there's a sense in which what one regrets is things one didn't dare to do rather than the things one was bold enough to do. So that's a professional position. And I think another professional position is dare to range widely. All too often we get stuck in one camp, and my life is in some ways a monument to the dangers, the follies, but I hope also the successes and the insights that come from being able to see across a number of disciplines. And really, in a way, if you don't understand the other adjacent disciplines or areas of thought or human achievement, you don't even understand the one that you're in very well, because it becomes what it is in relation. Everything is in relation. You don't understand the relations between what you're doing when you're digging ever deeper into a gene. If you don't know much about humanity, its history, its philosophy, you will also lose a sense of what it is you're doing. And I've come to realize that very few people have, I don't think of anyone actually who's challenged my characterizations of the right and left hemisphere. I mean, almost nobody has spent so long going into the literature and seeing what the real differences are. So scientists don't disagree with that. And philosophers are remarkably open to the philosophy in my work. But the problem comes when scientists are asked to take the science and put it together with philosophy. That's the step that people resist. And so where there is resistance to my work, people go, well, you know, he uses scientific data to try and paint a picture of the way culture has evolved. I mean, duh, how can that be? But I'm sorry, the duh is on them, as it were.
Absolutely, it is.
Of course, these things relate. And some of the best, of course, because they would be the best kinds of scientists are those who are thinking more broadly, and they're, broadly speaking, more receptive to my work. It tends to be people who are lost in a silo, who can't see how you can make this bridge. So that's the professional hand on, as it were, hand over. In terms of personal life, well, I feel like quoting Montaigne. Que sais-je? At the end of all this, what do I really know? I suppose all I can say is that there is an importance in relationships as being primary, that that we need to, if I could start my life again realizing what I've only realized lately, which is that relationships are prior to everything else. It doesn't sound sensible to people trained in a world in which there are atomistic things and they then have to be related. But no, the things emerge from the relations, and those relations are with one another, but also with humanity, with the broader field of nature, and with the divine. These seem to me the most important things to be able to perceive, to cultivate, and to try to come to understand. And I suppose there are other things which however bad I am at actually embodying them, I still profoundly believe in and try to be guided by. And those are things like forgiveness, gratitude, compassion, wonder, humility. I mean, I think if one can get those things into one's life, easier said than done, but if one can always bear them in mind and always see how well or ill one is managing to achieve them, that's a very good lodestar.
Yes, and it's all about embodiment in that sense. It's all very well having wonderful principles, but if you can't embody them or don't embody them, then you're missing the real point. And just to end,
Exactly.
Ian, I'd like just to circle back to Winchester, because I think that the intellectual outlook, and particularly how you related that to what you learned from Martin Scott, is really quite unique. And I speak as an Etonian, as you know, but someone who's taught at Winchester, because I think this div system, whereby you are actually encouraged to think more widely, think more contextually, relate across the disciplines. And even on the C ladder, the science ladder, you still have to write an essay every 2 weeks. It's not just all about lab experiments. And so I think this ethos that you absorbed as a scholar at Winchester has really pervaded your life, and you're an exemplar, if you like, of what can come out of that broad and deep humanist and sacred outlook.
Yes, I have an enormous, incalculable debt of gratitude to Winchester for the education I received. And it was a sort of almost by chance that I ended up there. I don't come from a background in which people were public school educated at all, and my parents certainly wouldn't have paid for me to go to a public school. but all the way through, I've been lucky enough to be scholar, and my fees paid at Winchester and then at Oxford and so on. So I was lucky to be able to access what really was the early meaning of the foundation of Winchester, which was for scholars, poor scholars, who would go there and become, the leading lights in the church, as William of Wykeham hoped. So there's something in the ethos that has carried on for 600, 700 years nearly, and it's something very, very important and increasingly difficult to find in this world. I might say, just on a adjunctive note, that All Souls College, of which I was a fellow several times, also exemplifies this. Part of its whole raison d'etre was the idea that you would bring together people from different specialities and that they would exchange their ideas fruitfully together. And in order to get in there at the age I got in at 21, you had to sit an exam in which you had to know about lots and lots of things other than your personal chosen discipline, so to speak. And I'm afraid that, as far as I can understand, it's beginning to adjust itself, if one may say, under the pressures of the modern system of specialization, to produce, no doubt brilliant specialists, but where is left in the world for us to bring together people who are not only good in their special subjects, but think broadly across the board? Because that's what we need. That is what we need more than anything else in our intellectual world, I believe.
Thank you so much, Ian. That's been a very rich session, and drawing on many different aspects of your life and experience. And I'm sure our listeners will find it quite fascinating. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, David. It's been a great pleasure, of course, as always.